With Brimstone right around the corner, there's going to be a major shakeup when it comes to DPSing in New World. Well, here is the best all-around DPS, version 2. All right, let's get started. So with Brimstone, there was a few changes to the way PvE works and, well, weapons in general. First, let's talk about a change to mob resistances. Mobs no longer have a natural resistance. For instance, if you're in Garden of Genesis, they used to be resistant to thrust damage. They are now no longer resistant to thrust damage. If you're in a mutation, let's say Hellfire, you still don't want to use a Fire Staff because they still will have that, but base mob resistances are just no longer a thing. So that is a net buff to almost every build, at least if you're using a weapon that doesn't really deal extra damage to them. Now, there's also a nerf. Now, back bar abilities, weapons, anything like that, any type of buff you get on one bar, it does not translate to the other. So, in my last build, the all-around DPS, we ran Hatchet Spear. The Fortify and Perforate was something we always open with to give us that extra tankiness. That no longer is the case. And you can see that here represented by, we're going to get Fortified from our ability here. You can see that we have Fortify, we swap, and they all disappear. So this is a pretty big nerf to a lot of builds, and it hurts a little bit of build diversity, which is unfortunate, but have no fear. This build absolutely pumps. This build does more damage, more AoE. The two things that this build lacks a little bit is hard CC and rend. We do not have those two things. If you want to swap out the spear for the great axe, I can definitely see that. It is very well something you can do, but if you have enough rend in your group, you can definitely do that. Or if you're looking for a little bit more solo potential and a little bit more AoE burst mixed with a ton of single target, this build really, really slaps. So let's talk a little bit about the Greatsword. So with the Greatsword, the first thing you need to know is we have two different stances. We have Onslaught stance, the Path of Onslaught, and then we have the Defiant stance, which is Path of Defiance. Now, the buffs here, you can go ahead and read them. We're basically on Onslaught stance, we're going to get a ton of extra damage, but we're going to take a ton extra, 15 and 15. And then you see here, the big thing is heavy attacks charge twice as fast, but now consume 10 stamina. And then when we go to Roaring Rupture, or I should say the Path of Defiance stance, you can see here the Defiant stance has the following properties. You take 15% less damage, but you do 15% less damage, and then you block incoming attacks while charging heavy attacks. So we have a very tanky side and a very offensive side. Now, we do have some abilities over here, which I think you need. If you really want to try to pump as much damage, you can go Skyward Slash, but Skyward Slash honestly doesn't really provide any DPS at all. So it's sort of just an ability you'd have if you took the last passive to do some extra AoE burst damage. But in my opinion, you definitely need to have the ability to swap stances whenever you want. Now, you can always get out of a stance. You can always go from Onslaught or Defiance into a neutral stance, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But let's talk about how abilities work with stance swapping. First, we have to look at each ability has a little tag you see there at the very end. It says enter Onslaught stance when this ability ends. Each ability in the Greatsword Tree has this tag. So you can see here Defiant stance when it ends and Defiant stance when this ability ends. So if you want to do, for instance, if we look at Relentless Rush, we go down here and it says in Onslaught stance, Relentless Rush applies a root. And then in Defiant stance, Relentless Rush heals for 15% of its damage, max of 5 hits. So in order for me to get the heal, I have to go into Defiant stance first and then hit my Relentless Rush. But if I want to actually do the root, then I have to be on the Onslaught tree and then use the ability. So pretty self-explanatory. Now, other than hitting abilities, we can enter it 2 other ways. First off, each tree has its own passive. We are only taking aggressive shift, and this just means whenever you hit a heavy attack, we are going to go into Onslaught stance. And then you can, if you would like, do the blocking for 2 seconds, causes you to enter Defiant stance. But honestly, I'm not really worried about that because if you want to take less damage, there's actually other ways you can do it. And we really don't want to block for 2 seconds and really not have that DPS up. Plus, we are a little bit stamina starved on this build. So just having an extra block in there is really not what we're really into. So let's talk about the abilities. First and foremost, your highest DPS uptime is going to be on Crosscut. This is essentially just a normal triple attack. It does 110, 130, then 160% weapon damage. This is pretty insane for DPS. It is basically AoE. The last hit's not quite as much AoE, but it does a ton of damage, and we are taking every passive. It says here, and in Defiant Stance, gain stun immunity while performing Crosscut. And then you get Grit while performing Crosscut just by the natural ability of it. And then for the last one, the base damage of the final strike is increased by 100% if the target is below 50% health, so a big execute. And then in Onslaught Stance, the threshold is increased to 75%. So if they are above 75% or below 75% health, the last hit of this is going to do 260% weapon damage, which is absolutely nuts. Next, we're going to go over here to Relentless Rush. And this is honestly one of my favorite abilities. It's very flexible, and you can actually use it for a few different things. So first, it says dashes through foes while spinning and apply a 20% slow for 4 seconds on hit. First hit is 110% weapon damage. Second hit is 120. Honestly, you're really not going to use this unless you're doing AoE. This isn't really a single target DPS increase, but we have a nice little 10% empowerment on here. So if you're doing solo, this is great even on solo targets to spin through them, a little bit reposition, maybe get a heal if you're in the Defiance tree, which will show you the last passive. You've already seen it, and get that 10% in power. And then we take Adaptive Rush. This is on the Onslaught Street, we get the root, and then in Defiant Stance, we get the heal. So pretty nice self-sustain if you're out there soloing content. Now, we do have some clips you will see of me soloing the Elite Zone with this exact build. We don't have a lot of the pieces we actually need, a lot of the gear pieces. So you will be a lot better on live than you are right here, but I wanted to show it to you anyway. And then for the rest of the passives, we're taking, of course, Aggressive Shift. We showed you that already. We're taking Charged Heavies. Attacks have 15% armor penetration. This is a really big one here. After gaining Onslaught Stance, your next attack within 5 seconds has a 100% increased critical chance, which is really good. We're taking Critical Comeback, become energized by landing a critical hit and regain 5 stamina and 5% base health per second for 5 seconds with a 10-second cooldown. This is huge for our sustain. It gives us a bunch of stamina, a bunch of health. This is just an overall fantastic passive. We are taking Step and Strike. This is another really good one. And after dodging, gain 10% in power for the next 3 hits within 10 seconds. Attacks empowered by this effect restore 10 stamina on hit. We have a lot of stamina recovery. We have some extra empowerment here. Just overall, a lot of damage and a lot of sustain. Now we have Unrelenting Assault. This is essentially just like Refreshing Move on steroids. We have light attacks, reduce your cooldowns by 2%, and Charged Heavies reduce them by 10%. And remember, when we're on Onslaught Stance, which we can be there 100% of the time, so every basically basic attack we do, because it's going to be a Charged Heavy, will reduce our cooldowns by 10%, which is absolutely massive. Now on the Defiance side of the tree, we are taking Perfect Vigilance. If you're hit while at full health, reduce the damage taken by 20%, then gain a 25% Fortify for 3 seconds. This has a 20% cooldown. It's just honestly a little bit better than hitting with the final attack of the Greatsword Chain, reduces the duration of debuffs on you by 10%. This is realistically more of a PvP perk, and then honestly, we're going to be doing mainly heavy attacks. We're really never going to get to the end of our chain. And then we are taking Blade Honing, just a nice little damage increase for each Greatsword buff on you. We're taking a really nice passive here in Charged Heavies, have Grit and inflict bleeding for 6 seconds, dealing 5% weapon damage every second. And then we showed you the ability Roaring Rupture. I love this skill. So here's what it reads. Stab the ground and send out a shockwave with a 4-meter radius that deals 120% weapon damage. Gain 8% Fortify for 5 seconds for each foe hit, max of 3. This ability generates threat and has Grit. And then it says enter Defiant Stance when this ability ends. So pretty awesome. Yeah, it provides threat, but you really don't have to worry about that. And then we have Cleansing 2 debuffs after using Roaring Rupture. This is more of a PvP thing, but can affect you in PvE as well. But we realistically just want to get down here to the other abilities. Next, we have the Shockwave, and it's Intimidating Roar. The Shockwave applies 10% weaken for 10 seconds on hit. Additionally, after a successful hit, become uninterruptible for 5 seconds. meaning you can do whatever ability you want. All your attacks, you won't be interrupted. You can't be staggered or anything like that. And it has a nice little, almost like Maelstrom-esque suck-in. Oh, sorry, that's on this one. So, yeah, get the 10% weaken. But, like I said, the little suck-in. And here we have Adaptive Rupture. In Defiant Stance, the Shockwave pushes foes outward, which you will never be in Defiant Stance when you do this because you have no other way to get in Defiant Stance other than to hit Roaring Rupture. And then the big one here is in Onslaught Stance, the Shockwave pulls foes 3 meters towards you. Again, like a nice little suck-in. You can group mobs super tight to just absolutely AoE cleave them down. The damage potential for this Greatsword is absolutely crazy. Now, there does come with a little bit of a drawback, meaning you will take 15% damage extra if you are in your Onslaught Stance. But honestly, you don't even have to be in Onslaught Stance to actually do damage. You can just see here, my basic attacks are hitting pretty decently hard. We don't have any big buffs up right now, but we just swing our sword pretty quickly. The big power here comes in our heavy attack. Our heavy attacks deal absolutely crazy amounts of damage. We don't have anything extra. We don't even have any good. We have a horrible sword. We'll show you the gear and what you kind of want to get when we get to the gearing section. But this Greatsword has really good survivability. The big thing is learning how to stance swap. Now, one thing I will give you as a tip before we move on to the Great Axe tree is when it comes to stance swapping, one thing you can do is once you get into a stance, you can see here we're holding our sword down and we have the like little extra abilities on our like little reticle. We have a different reticle. You can see we can actually swap stances. So we're actually going to go out. We're going to go back into Onslaught by just doing our heavy attack. And if you just weapon swap, you're out of the stance. So at any time you feel like you need to you don't want to take that extra 15% damage, you can always just weapon swap and do that. Now, if you want to do more damage because you're in, let's say, the Defiance tree, you can either use an ability, which you have 2 of them, and most of the time they're going to be up, or you can just do a heavy attack. There's no real reason to swap unless you... there might be some instance where you don't want to be in Defiant Stance or Onslaught Stance, but you're on Defiant Stance already. But there's really, in my opinion, not a big reason to ever swap once you're into Defiant Stance, unless you just want to go to Onslaught Stance with an ability or a heavy attack. So keep that in mind. So you can basically cancel out any time you want to get to, cancel out of the Onslaught Stance, just swap your weapon, or do your Roaring Rupture, and you will swap right out of it. Next, let's talk about the Great Axe. This is a fairly standard build for PvE. We are taking Reap, Maelstrom, and Gravity Well. Now, we do have a little bit more self-sustain on here because you'll be able to use this soloing content, and you'll be able to use this inside dungeons as well. So we have Reap. We're taking every bit of it. That extra little damage there and Fatal Attraction is pretty good. You don't necessarily have to take this. You can take maybe like the increased armor penetration of Great Axe attacks by 10%, goes below 50% health. But I do like that extra attack because basically you're going to be on this bar to just AoE. You're not going to be on this when it comes to bosses that often, which is one of the reasons why I love the Greatsword so much, because we can get Roaring Rupture. And if we want to just be tanky but still do damage, we can get that Fortify, we can attack, get into our Onslaught Stance, and now we can get that ability charged right back down. Look, we're at 2, 1, we can hit it again. Now we can just go ahead and hit a heavy attack. And we still have the Fortify. We're taking less damage with the Fortify. It's just, that's the reason why we went with the Greatsword over everything else, because you can be very tanky in that, as well as do absolutely crazy amounts of damage. So we're focusing on the Great Axe with AoE. You are just going to be the absolute clumper. We have 4 abilities that can clump enemies. We have, well, Roaring Rupture from the Greatsword, which we showed that to you already. And then we have Maelstrom, Gravity Well, and Reap. If you are playing this build and you can't get the mobs in a tight little group, I don't know there's like no better way to get them in a tight group to absolutely nuke them down. Let's go over the tree. We are taking Mauler's Fury. Honestly, you're going to be doing some AoE damage with this, so you're going to stack this up pretty quickly. But we are taking Reap all the way down. We are taking the passive's Greed, give us some extra damage, some heal when we crit, critical damage increased by 10%, and Speed, which Great Axe attacks against foes below 30% health, heal you for 10% damage done. Honestly, this is very much the weakest passive in this entire tree. If you want extra damage, I just probably do the armor penetration if you're solo. But you can also do stuff like the Great Axe attacks against foes below 30% health. have a 15% increased critical chance. Now, you should be attacking if you are playing group play always from behind, so crit chance really doesn't mean anything. But just note that this is by far probably the weakest passive here. I wouldn't do whenever you get blocked, because you're just never going to block. You get some haste, but really don't want that. So let's go over the Mauler tree. We are taking Maelstrom all the way down to no reprieve. We're getting, of course, Enduring Strikes, adds grit to the Great Axe heavy attacks, also grants 12% damage reduction while grit is active. We have 300 strength, so we always have grit active, so we are basically always getting a 12% damage reduction. We're going Gravity Well all the way down. We're going to get a little bit of Fortify, and then we have Crowded Protection and Center of Attention. Like I said, we are going to be AoEing on this build, so we want a little bit of extra damage mitigation and extra damage when we have a bunch of mobs near us, because that's what we're going to be doing, is grouping the mobs up. Now I want to talk a little bit about gear, and I want to talk about Heart Rune gems and Runestone gems. So if you don't know, Heart Rune gems are essentially, we call them ultimate abilities, but they are just abilities that are going to add a little bit extra. They're essentially ultimates. You do have to charge them up, but they're actually all pretty cool. Before we get to those, let's talk a little bit about our weapons. So first off, I opened up every single weapon cast I could, and I didn't get any good weapons. You have the normal good stuff here. Keen, not a very good perk because you want to be attacking from behind. It's not a horrible perk if you are only soloing. If you're only soloing, Keen is actually a pretty good perk. So if you're soloing, I would say something like Keen, Vicious, Keenly Empowered is a very generically good greatsword. If you're doing more group play, looking for dungeons, then Rogues and Trenchant crits are really, really good. If you can get Rogue, Trenchant crits, plus a Bane, it's probably going to end up being your best in slot. Trenchant crits is pretty insane. I'm going to throw up a Greatsword right here that has Keen, Trenchant crits, and Keenly Jagged. It is a recipe that you have to find, and then a great weaponsmith has to make it for you. But it's actually a very good overall just DPS weapon until you can actually get your really good greatsword. Next, when it comes to your great axe, here it's just very standard. You want the Bane if you can get it. If not, we're looking for stuff like Rogue, Keenly Empowered. Thwarting Strikes is absolutely insane on everything, you know, even over like something like Vicious, like we said on the greatsword. We are running 300 strength, so Thwarting Strikes is pretty insane. I think Thwarting crits is a little bit better for the greatsword because the amount of damage that we do with our heavy attacks, we do so much damage with our heavy attacks. 90% of our damage is going to come from our heavy attacks, but especially on the great axe, we probably do want Thwarting Strikes here. Then after Thwarting Strikes, you can just get, like I said, Rogue, Bane, etc. You can get Vicious if you can get Thwarting Strikes, but just if you can't find anything, just get the Hook. The Hook is out of the Barnacles and Black Powder. It's just a pretty decent overall great axe. Next, we are running light armor. Again, armor is kind of your preference. I prefer light armor. I do go more warded gear. This was just the PvP stuff that I had on. So in the clips that you're going to see me going around soloing some of the content, just note that I'm in gear that is literally as bad as you can get. You can see here, I don't know if I have any perk that's even relevant. We have a couple refreshing, slowing tether, corrupted. I guess we have one piece of corrupted ward, and I think we were doing a corrupted mobs, but yeah, we don't even have any good gear. But here, of course, for PvE, you're looking for refreshings. You're looking for wards. Lucks are good. I don't really ever mess with stuff like Invigorated. And they're just really not that good. And I found that a lot of times they just don't even work. So get your weapon perks. Get your refreshings. You can get luck, and your wards are basically what you're looking for. When it comes to weapon perks, we want Insatiable Gravwell is probably one of the biggest. It does a nice big chunk of damage. Crippling Reap is okay, and Enfeebling Maelstrom is okay as well. Those are pretty decent perks to get, but you don't absolutely have to have them. We do want all the perks from the Greatsword if you can get them. The Leeching Crosscut's really good. Roaring Rupture provides a nice slow if you can get it. And Relentless Freedom, I believe, provides a nice big chunk of crit chance. So those are all nice, but honestly, as long as you can get the Insatiable Gravwell, then probably the Leeching Crosscut. Everything after that is just a little bit of a bonus. There's not too many great perks for the Greatsword when it comes to PvE DPS, but just note that those are actually pretty good to get. When it comes to jewelry, it's all pretty standard. We went refreshings as well. Health, Divine are great, especially we do have a decent amount of self-sustain. Divine is going to increase that. We just have horrible stuff here on the PTR, so don't really pay attention to this. And Stamina Recovery is also good. If I had to pick an amulet, I'd probably go Health, Divine, and Refreshing. We really don't need the Stamina Recovery that much. It is a very, very good perk, but for PvE DPS, you don't really need it that much. When it comes to the ring, we're looking for Hardy. If you're running light armor, you have to have Hardy. If you're running medium, you do not. And then we're looking for Slashing. Because we have 2 slashing weapons, that is just going to be the most damage. And then after that, we're just looking for a Refreshing. And then your earring, pretty standard. I like Nimble, especially on this build. And then Refreshing Toast. And then this is pretty close. This is Refreshing Ward. We're really looking for, again, a Refreshing here. Now let's talk about Heart Rune Gems. Now, this one is actually going to change depending on what you actually need. And I think it's going to change between one of 2 things. First and foremost, if you're looking to solo and you're looking for a nice heal, a little bit of extra damage, you're probably actually going to go with this one. And it's the Brutal Heart Rune of Dark Ascent. This isn't the most damage, but it does provide a ton of healing. And here's what it reads. So it has a ability here that says, Empowered Ascent successfully hits, deals 150% Heart Rune damage, but no longer staggers. And then Leeching Ascent heals for 100% of damage done. So you can see if we look up what Heart Rune Ascent actually does as you fly up into the air and then plummet down back to the ground, staggering and deal 100% Heart Rune damage within a 3-meter radius. Press the Heart Rune ability or basic attack input to while hovering to be trigger the fall immediately. So we're going to actually show you what that looks like here, and you're going to see it in the clip as well. So we're going to fly up, and then we're going to go down. Actually, let's put on a Void Gauntlet so you can see how much it heals for. Let's go ahead and suck our life. All right, now we got our life pretty low. The one thing to note is you will do more damage if you're in your Onslaught tree and you have Empowered up. So we get a couple Empowers. So I'm going to try to dodge. I'm going to do my Relentless Rush, and then it's going to give us a double Empower, and then we are going to hit the ability and see how much it does. So then you see there, it dealt 4,000 damage, and we got healed for 4,000. So it's not like super overpowered by anything, but it does give you a nice big heal. Now, we actually, will heal off of every enemy we hit, so it can be in a big group of mobs, a essentially full heal. So keep that in mind. Now, if you want to go just straight for damage and you're doing dungeons, then the rune you're going to use is Brutal Heart Rune of Detonate. And this essentially charges yourself with explosive energy for 3 seconds and then detonate, dealing 100% rune damage within a 5-meter radius. And then our perks on it are Escalating Explosion. Explosion damage is increased by 30%, but you take 15% more damage while charging. So remember, we take 15% more damage while in our Onslaught tree, and we will we'll take 15% increased damage as well when we have this rune activated, and then we get increased movement speed. And I will show you what that looks like here. All right, so we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna dodge, Relentless Rush, and hit our ability. And it actually did so much damage it one-shot the dummy, and it didn't give us the damage. But just know it does a significant amount of damage. I did put out a video talking about the Heart Rune Gems, and these do absolutely crazy amounts of damage. So if you want more just straight damage, of course, Detonate is going to be your thing. You're going to have times where you're just going to go in and completely annihilate the entire group of mobs with Detonate. When it comes to PvE, it is going to be a speed running essential. You're going to group mobs up with a Great Axe. People are going to run in with their detonates. They're going to have 2 or 3 people completely annihilate the entire group without even having any effort. These are going to be absolutely crazy. So if you want more sustain, I suggest the Dark Ascent. But if you're looking for just straight damage, we're looking at the Brutal Heart Rune of Detonate. So when it comes to rune gems, these are something that was newly added or will be newly added to the Brimstone update. And these are essentially just modified regular gems, but they do have a little bit of a downside. So you can see here, we are running an opal, and it says 12% in damage while your stamina is not full. That is typically 15%. And it says, and hits inflict surge, dealing 8% lightning damage per second for 2 seconds. This is actually going to hit 3 times, which I will show you right here. 145, 145, 145. So it will hit 3 times. Now, whenever you increase your weapon damage, be that empowerment, be that, you know, the onslaught stance, we can actually just do the little test here. And you can see here, instead of 145, we're now up to 191. This also does AoE damage. Can I hit both? Oh, we did. Okay, so you can see there on AoE, it'll tick on every single mob you hit. There's no cooldown on it. And this is essentially going to be an absolute staple for any build that is looking for extra damage. Now, you can do something like stamina. If you run out of stamina for dodging, that might be actually really, really good for PvP. Or you can do something like leeching. That's not too bad. The ones that I would definitely stay away from are ones like this that give you additional melee damage. Because if you look, it actually only gives you 2% melee damage, and you're losing the 3% from the opal. So let's go to the opal. You see here 12% damage and 2% melee damage while you're on your weapon. The top number is your weapon. The bottom one is on your armor. So it's actually a DPS decrease to put this on your weapon. I think this should probably be something like a 4%. Give us a little bit more damage, but yeah, so I thought that was a little bit odd. So don't ever put one of these on your weapon. Don't ever put the ranged one or the melee one, because it is just a net decrease in damage if you're running something like the opal. Now, when it comes to your armor, we're going to go very standard. We're going to go a pretty hard towards physical defense. Most enemies in the game are actually physical. Now, in Brimstone, there's actually a lot of fire, and there is a little bit of, I believe it's arcane / like corruption. So that does a little bit extra elemental. So we're not full physical, but you can see here, we have armor that is weighted for physical. We have 917 to 606. You don't need to recognize those numbers. Just know if you are like, maybe you have void bent, you have more elemental resistant than physical. You want to go a lot more physical. But I go physical for the most part anyway. And you can see here we're at 11.6 physical resistance and 5.9 elemental. I think this is about what you want to run. You could probably throw an extra opal in there because our armor is so heavily weighted towards physical. But again, we have the melee damage in each one of these. We're getting 5% extra melee damage from these gems. These are absolutely something you do not have to have. This is something, when it comes to mutations, people aren't going to want to run because these are going to be super expensive to craft, and it's not going to be something you're just swapping out from time to time. This is going to be something more PvP related, but if you're wanting to build one set of gear to do everything, then definitely want to put these in your gems. You do lose a little bit of defense. You can see here, instead of 2.5% elemental damage absorption, we're only getting 2%, but I think it's definitely worth it for an extra 1% melee damage. Next, when it comes to attributes, this is always something that's really up to you. First, we are going to 300 strength. We have to have the 300 strength. We want that to get our thwarting strikes for our great axe. It is very, very important that we get there. And then next, we're going to put 50 points into dexterity. Now, if you don't feel comfortable with only 150 con, maybe you're dying a little bit too much, you can, of course, go to 200 constitution. That is going to give you that extra 10% increase to physical and elemental armor. But as you start getting more used to the build, just continue putting points into dexterity and taking points out of constitution. I think where I will end up with this build, because we are going to take a little bit more damage from the Greatsword, I will end up being at the 100 con. On a lot of my builds, I will go down to 50 con, but because we are taking 15% extra damage from the Greatsword, we will probably only end up going down to 50 con. But don't just get yourself killed because you want to pump out the most damage. You can do 200, 300 on this build and absolutely pump more damage than probably anybody else in that dungeon not running a Greatsword just with that setup. Now, if you want to run a strictly Greatsword setup and you're not really worried about the great axe, you can go a 200 setup and then a 100. And then that's probably about the most damage you're going to do. But then again, you're not getting thwarting strikes. So I really just do like the 300 strength passive. The 200 dexterity passive is really, really good and does a ton of damage. If you want to just absolutely pump on great axe or Greatsword, you are going to probably want to hit that passive. But other than that, I'm going 300 and then just continuously pumping damage into dex after that. All right, guys, I think that about covers it. We're going to show you some gameplay of me just going into the elite zone. This is more for a dungeon base, but it shows that even though we are essentially a dungeon build, you can easily go in solo content. Am I saying you're going to always live? No, you're going to probably sometimes get killed by, just getting that extra 15% damage while you're on your Greatsword. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This build is absolutely going to shred, and you will be able to get into any dungeon. Well, maybe other than Dynasty. Dynasty, you know, people... Dynasty's a hard one on mutation, but other than that, I mean, this will be BIS on Dynasty, you know, but, you know, it's just a hard dungeon, okay? But this build will absolutely shred. We will have some gameplay right after this. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like, comment, subscribe, like always, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.